Sarah Bennett didn't mean to message a killer. She just needed $5 to feed her son. It was 2 a.m., and the only light in Sarah's apartment came from the flickering red, low battery warning on her phone. She sat on a bare mattress, her breath visible in the freezing air because the heat had been cut a week ago. Her son, Leo, wasn't crying anymore, he was too weak for that, just whimpering as he sucked on a dry pacifier. The eviction notice was taped to her door. The loan sharks were texting her threats that made her blood run cold. She was out of time. With shaking thumbs, she typed a final plea to her cousin, "Please, I just need $5 for 1 can of formula. I'm begging you. I'll do anything." She hit send, her phone dying the second the message left her outbox. She didn't see the typo. She didn't see that the last digit was a 7 instead of a 1. 5 miles away, in a penthouse made of glass and cold silence, Dante DeLuca, the man the newspapers called the Ice King, watched his private burner phone vibrate. This was a phone for hits, for million-dollar payoffs, and for the few family members he had left alive. He stared at the message from the unknown number. Most people who bothered Dante DeLuca ended up in the Hudson River. He should have deleted it. But the words, "I'll do anything," echoed a voice from his own past, a mother who had died waiting for a miracle that never arrived. Dante didn't send $5. 10 minutes later, Sarah's phone flickered back to life just long enough to show a notification that stopped her heart. Venmo, you received $50,000 from D. DeLuca. Underneath was a single message, the formula is on the way. Don't let Leo cry again. Sarah's breath hitched. She felt a wave of relief so strong it made her sick, until the cold reality hit her. She had never mentioned her son's name. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit like and subscribe. Now, let's see what happens when the most dangerous man in New York decides you belong to him. The silence in the apartment was heavier than the cold. Sarah stared at her phone screen, the glowing numbers of the Venmo transfer blurring behind a veil of hot, confused tears. $50,000. It was a figure so large it didn't feel like money, it felt like a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and hunger. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the blinking cursor on her screen. Who was D. DeLuca? And how, in the name of God, did he know Leo's name? Across the city, the atmosphere was entirely different, yet just as tense. In the sprawling, minimalist penthouse atop the DeLuca Tower, Dante stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Manhattan bleeding into the darkness like spilled jewels. He was a man composed of sharp edges and expensive silk, his face a mask of brutal indifference that had earned him the title of the Ice King. In his right hand, he gripped a glass of neat bourbon, in his left, he held the burner phone as if it were a live grenade. His jaw was set so tight it ached. When the text had first chirped, his thumb had hovered over the delete button. His life was governed by a simple rule: anything that didn't bring profit or power was a liability. But the raw, jagged desperation in that message had pierced through a decade of scar tissue. "I'll do anything." It was the anything that had haunted his dreams for 24 years, the sound of his mother's voice promising the same thing to a landlord who eventually threw them into the snow. Dante let out a breath that was almost a growl. He didn't like being moved. He didn't like the sudden, irrational urge to protect a stranger. He turned to the shadows of the room where his head of security, Marco, stood motionless. "Find her," Dante commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "Sarah Bennett. 402, Miller Street. I want to know every debt she owes, every person who has ever raised a hand to her, and why her son is hungry." "Sir." Marco hesitated, surprised by the deviation from their night's agenda. Dante turned, his eyes flashing with a predatory intensity that made even his most loyal soldier take a half-step back. "I didn't ask for your opinion. I want a perimeter around that building before the sun comes up. If a single soul so much as knocks on her door with bad intentions, they don't leave the hallway alive." He looked back at the phone, his thumb tracing the name Leo on the screen. He had already hacked the carrier data the moment the text arrived. He knew her life story before she'd even put her phone down. He was a monster, a man who built empires on the bones of his enemies, but tonight, the monster had found something to guard. Back in the dark apartment, Sarah clutched Leo to her chest, unaware that the most feared man in New York had just declared her his private territory. She was still waiting for a miracle, not realizing that the devil had already answered her prayer. The digital glow of the Venmo confirmation began to feel like a trap. Sarah sat on the edge of her sagging mattress, the light from the screen reflecting in her wide, panicked eyes. $50,000. It was enough to pay her back rent, clear her mother's medical bills, and buy enough formula to fill a warehouse. But in the world Sarah lived in, nothing was free. Money like this didn't come from a wrong number, it came from a deal she hadn't realized she'd signed. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the few articles she could find on the name DeLuca. Every headline was a warning: acquittal in waterfront homicide. The Ice King of New York. Investigation into DeLuca cartel stalls. The man who had just sent her a fortune wasn't a philanthropist. He was a predator. A sudden ping shattered the silence of the room. Sarah flinched, nearly dropping the phone. A new message. "I'm outside your building, Sarah." The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. She scrambled toward the window, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it would crack her ribs. Pulling the edge of the yellowed curtain back just an inch, she peered down into the rain-slicked street 4 stories below. The neighborhood was usually a chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting, but tonight, it was unnervingly still. Parked directly under the flickering street lamp was a matte black SUV, its engine idling with a low, predatory hum. The windows were tinted a deep, impenetrable black, reflecting the grime of the tenements back at them. 2 men in dark suits stood like statues on the sidewalk, their eyes scanning the entrance to her building. They weren't the loan sharks. These men didn't look like they wanted to break her windows, they looked like they were waiting to go to war. Sarah backed away from the window, clutching Leo tighter. Her relief had completely curdled into a cold, sharp terror. He knew her name. He knew her address. He was here. Why? Was the money bait? Was this how men like Dante DeLuca collected on the anything she had promised in her text? Her phone vibrated again, the haptic buzz feeling like an electric shock against her palm. "The heater in your unit is broken," the text read. "And the lock on your front door is loose. Put the chain on. No one is getting past the lobby tonight." She stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. He wasn't just outside. He was watching her. He knew about the broken radiator and the faulty deadbolt. It was as if he were a ghost in the machine, inhabiting her very life through the lens of her phone. She was no longer just a woman struggling to survive, she was a bird in a very expensive, very dangerous cage. The morning sun didn't bring warmth, only a harsh light that exposed the peeling wallpaper and the empty cans of generic soup in Sarah's kitchen. She sat at her small, rickety table, the laptop she usually used for job hunts whirring loudly as she delved into the digital shadow of Dante DeLuca. Every click felt like opening a door she wouldn't be able to close. The search results were a grim gallery of power and blood. She found a grainy photo of Dante from a court hearing 3 years ago. He looked like a statue carved from obsidian, his eyes 2 chips of frozen gray that seemed to stare through the camera and into her soul. The articles painted a terrifying picture. He had ascended to the throne of the DeLuca empire after a restructuring that left 4 of his rivals missing and the city's piers stained red. One journalist described him as a man without a pulse, a leader who ruled through cold logic rather than passion. They called him the Ice King because he didn't just kill his enemies, he froze them out of existence, seizing their assets and erasing their names. Sarah's breath hitched as she found an archived police report from 20 years prior. It mentioned a woman, Elena DeLuca, who had died in a tenement fire caused by a slumlord's negligence. There was a brief mention of a surviving son. The dates lined up. Dante hadn't just been born into this world, he had been forged in the same fire of poverty that was currently consuming Sarah. She looked from the screen to the expensive, organic formula now sitting on her counter, delivered silently at dawn by a man who didn't even wait for a thank you. The contrast was paralyzing. This was the man who had allegedly ordered the disappearance of a union boss, yet he was the only one who cared that Leo's stomach was empty. He was a devil who had decided to play the part of a guardian angel. The realization made her skin crawl with a mix of gratitude and dread. She knew how the world worked. Men like Dante didn't give, they invested. By accepting the $50,000, she hadn't just saved her son, she had inadvertently sold her silence, her safety, or perhaps something even more intimate to a man who had never shown mercy in his life. She closed the laptop, the silence of the apartment now feeling like a heavy, expectant weight. She was no longer just Sarah Bennett, the invisible single mother. She was a line item in the ledger of a king, and the Ice King always collected his debts. The afternoon air in the hallway of the tenement building felt thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and damp rot. Sarah stepped out of her apartment, clutching Leo's diaper bag to her chest like a shield. She needed to get to the grocery store, to finally buy the fresh milk and supplies that weren't part of the morning's mysterious delivery. But as she reached the top of the stairs, a shadow blocked her path. It was Gary, the neighbor from 4C. He was a man who smelled of stale beer and bad intentions, someone who had spent months making casual comments about Sarah's late rent and her lack of a husband. Today, he looked particularly bold, leaning against the banister with a yellowed grin. "Here you got some visitors today, Sarah," Gary drawled, his eyes roaming over her with a predatory laziness. "Big black cars. Shiny suits. You holding out on me? Maybe you've got more money than you've been letting on." He took a step closer, invading her personal space until she could feel the heat of his breath. "Why don't we go back inside and talk about how you're gonna catch up on those favors you owe me for keeping the landlord off your back?" Sarah felt the familiar, cold spike of fear in her gut. She tightened her grip on Leo, her eyes darting toward the exit. "Move, Gary. I don't have time for this." "I think you do," he sneered, reaching out a meaty hand to grab her upper arm. He never touched her. Before Gary's fingers could close around her skin, a hand, gloved in black leather and moving with the speed of a striking viper, clamped onto his wrist. A man Sarah hadn't even noticed stood there. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than the entire building, and his face was a mask of professional boredom. Gary yelped, his knees buckling as the stranger applied a precise, agonizing pressure to a nerve in his arm. "She told you to move," the man in the suit said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the flat, terrifying resonance of a tombstone hitting the ground. "Who the hell are you?" Gary gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of purple. "I'm the person who is going to suggest you move to a different floor," the stranger replied. He leaned in closer to Gary's ear, his tone dropping to a whisper that Sarah could barely catch. "And if you ever breathe the same air as Ms. Bennett again, the police won't be the ones finding what's left of you. Do we understand each other?" Gary didn't wait to answer. As soon as the stranger released his grip, the neighbor scrambled back into his apartment, the sound of 3 separate locks clicking into place echoing through the hall. The man in the suit turned to Sarah. He gave a sharp, polite nod, his expression revealing absolutely nothing. "The car is waiting downstairs, Ms. Bennett. Mr. DeLuca prefers you don't walk the streets alone today." Sarah stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was safe, but as she looked at the silent, lethal man standing guard, she realized the neighborhood's predators were no longer her biggest problem. She was now under the protection of the apex predator, and the world was beginning to move at his command. The rumble of the street began to change just as Sarah reached the sidewalk, the car seat containing Leo heavy in her hand. It wasn't the usual screech of rusted brakes or the thumping bass of passing beaters. This was a low, synchronized vibration that seemed to smooth out the chaos of the block. 4 identical black SUVs rounded the corner in a tight formation, their polished paint reflecting the grime of the tenements like a mirror. They didn't just park, they took over the street, pinning the sidewalk in a silent, armored perimeter. Sarah froze, her breath catching. For a terrifying heartbeat, she expected doors to fly open and gunmen to spill out, a consequence of her accidental connection to the Ice King. But the men who stepped out were different. They moved with a quiet, military precision, wearing earpieces and tailored suits. Without a word to the gathered crowd of stunned neighbors, they opened the rear hatches. They didn't pull out weapons. Instead, they began to unload crates that looked like they belonged in a high-end boutique or a private hospital. Sarah watched, paralyzed, as a line of men began carrying the bounty into her building. There were cases of premium organic formula, the kind that cost more for a single tin than Sarah made in a week. There were bundles of clothes made of Pima cotton and cashmere, still in their original wrapping. There were boxes of diapers, high-tech monitors, and even a portable crib that looked like it was designed for royalty. The lead man, the one who had intercepted Gary in the hallway, approached her. He held a thick, cream-colored envelope. His expression remained unreadable, but his movements were surprisingly respectful. Mr. DeLuca was informed of your living conditions, the man said, extending the envelope toward her. He found them unacceptable. Sarah took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside wasn't cash, but a legal document. It was a long-term lease for a luxury apartment in a secure building uptown, fully furnished and already paid for in her name. There was also a key card embossed with a subtle D logo. "I can't take this," Sarah whispered, the magnitude of the gift making the world tilt. "I didn't ask for a new life. I just asked for $50. "Mr. DeLuca doesn't do things halfway, Ms. Bennett," the man replied, his shadow falling over her as he gestured toward the idling lead vehicle. "The movers will handle what little you wish to keep from upstairs. This car is here to take you to your new home. It's time to go." Sarah looked up at the window of her crumbling apartment, then down at Leo, who was finally sleeping peacefully. She was stepping into a golden cage, traded from a lead one. She knew that by getting into that car, she was officially disappearing from the world of the poor and reappearing in the world of the DeLucas. The debt was no longer just financial, it was total. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and silence, a world away from the screeching tires and heavy humidity of the slums. Sarah stood in the center of the expansive living room, her feet sinking into a rug that felt like soft cloud. Leo was asleep in a crib that cost more than her mother's hospital bills, his breathing finally deep and rhythmic. The transition had been so fast, so surgical, that she felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Then, the phone in her hand began to vibrate. It wasn't the frantic buzz of a bill collector or the mocking ping of a loan shark. This was a steady, rhythmic pulse. The screen displayed no name, only a private number. Sarah's heart climbed into her throat as she pressed the phone to her ear. She didn't say hello. She couldn't find the air. "The apartment is to your liking, I hope." The voice was a low, resonant rasp, cold as a winter morning and just as sharp. It was the sound of iron and expensive scotch. Sarah gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Who is this? Is this Dante?" There was a pause on the other end, a silence so heavy she could almost feel his presence in the room. "You should be more careful with your tone, Sarah. Most people don't use my first name unless they're looking for a grave." Sarah's knees felt weak, and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. "Why are you doing this? The money, the car, the house. I can't pay you back. I have nothing." "I didn't ask for payment," Dante replied. The coldness in his voice didn't soften, but it shifted, turning from a threat into a barrier. "I spent my life watching things be taken from people who couldn't fight back. I decided a long time ago that I wouldn't let that happen in my city. Not to someone who fights the way you do." "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough. I know your credit score, your blood type, and the fact that you skipped 3 meals yesterday so your son could have the last of the milk." He let out a slow, deliberate breath. Understand this, Sarah. The world is full of people who think they can take what they want. They see a woman alone and they see a target. But they made a mistake with you. A mistake. They didn't realize you were under my shadow, Dante said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly protective depth. The loan sharks, the landlord, the neighbors, they're gone. I've cleared your slate. From this moment on, no one touches what is mine. And that includes you. You are safe because I said so. Do you understand? Sarah looked at the key card on the table, the D logo glinting in the moonlight. She felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. She was safe, yes, but she wasn't free. She had traded 1,000 small enemies for one massive, all-powerful guardian. I understand, she breathed. The line went dead before she could say another word, leaving her alone in the silent luxury of her new life. The move to the new apartment was scheduled for sunset, but the ghosts of Sarah's past didn't care about schedules. She was back at her old unit, packing a final bag of Leo's favorite toys, when the front door didn't just rattle, it groaned under the weight of a violent kick. The wood splintered around the frame, and 2 men burst into the room, bringing with them the stench of cheap cigarettes and unearned confidence. It was Rico and Vinny, the local muscle for the neighborhood loan sharks. They had been hounding Sarah for weeks over a $300 debt that had ballooned into thousands thanks to their predatory interest. Rico, a thick-necked man with a jagged scar across his chin, sneered as he looked around the room. Leaving so soon, Sarah? We heard you came into some money, Rico growled, kicking over a stack of empty boxes. You thought you could just disappear without settling up. That's not how the neighborhood works. I have your money, Sarah stammered, her hand moving toward her purse, but Vinny stepped forward, blocking her path. The price went up since breakfast, Vinny said, his eyes scanning the new, expensive baby supplies sitting on the floor. We'll take the cash, and we'll take these fancy crates. Consider it a late fee. He reached for the bag of premium formula, but he stopped midair. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. From the open, broken doorway, a shadow stretched across the floor, long and ominous. 3 men in charcoal gray suits stepped inside. They didn't look like the street thugs Sarah was used to, they looked like professional executioners. They didn't shout. They didn't even draw weapons. They simply stood there, their presence filling the small apartment with a suffocating, lethal weight. Who the hell are you? Rico barked, his bravado wavering as he realized his stature meant nothing in this room. The man in the center, the same bodyguard who had dealt with Gary, stepped forward. He didn't look at Rico, he looked at Sarah. Ms. Bennett, please take the child into the bedroom. This will be loud, and it will be messy. Hey! I'm talking to you. Rico lunged forward, but the bodyguard moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. In one motion, he caught Rico's throat and slammed him against the peeling wallpaper with enough force to make the building shake. You are trespassing on DeLuca property, the bodyguard said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. This woman owes you nothing. But you? You owe Mr. DeLuca an apology for breathing near her. Vinny turned to run, but the other 2 suited men were already there, their expressions as cold and unchanging as stone. Sarah didn't wait to see the rest. She retreated into the bedroom, clutching Leo to her chest and covering his ears. Through the thin walls, she heard the sound of breaking glass, the muffled thuds of a one-sided fight, and the desperate, high-pitched begging of men who had finally realized they had tried to rob the devil's favorite ward. 5 minutes later, the silence returned. There was a soft, polite knock on the bedroom door. The hallway is clear, Ms. Bennett, the bodyguard called out. The car is waiting. It's time to leave this place behind forever. The restaurant was a cavern of dark mahogany and whispered secrets, tucked away behind an unmarked door in Soho. It was the kind of place that didn't appear on maps, reserved only for those who moved the gears of the city. Sarah felt painfully exposed in the dress that had been waiting for her in the new apartment's closet, a simple, elegant slip of black silk that made her feel like an imposter. Dante DeLuca sat at a corner table, the candlelight playing across the sharp, predatory planes of his face. He didn't rise when she approached, he simply watched her with those frozen gray eyes, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his hand. Up close, the air around him felt heavy, charged with the kind of absolute authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be felt. "Sit," he said, the word less of an invitation and more of a gravitational pull. Sarah sat, her hands trembling as she placed her purse on the linen tablecloth. She reached inside and pulled out a cashier's check. It was for the full $50,000. "I can't keep this, Mr. DeLuca. And I can't keep the apartment." Dante didn't even glance at the paper. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving her face. "You've spent the last 3 years being stepped on, Sarah. You think that returning that check buys your independence back? You think it makes you safe? I don't want to be beholden to a man like you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know who you are. I know where this money comes from." Dante leaned forward, the shadows of the booth swallowing him. "You think I gave you that money because I wanted a return on investment? I gave it to you because I recognized the sound of a woman who had run out of miracles. My mother died in a room exactly like the one you just left because no one answered her texts. No one looked down." He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the check, but he didn't touch it. "If you walk out that door and go back to the gutter, you aren't being proud. You're being a martyr. And martyrs make for very poor mothers. Leo doesn't need a mother with clean hands, he needs a mother who ensures he never has to know what hunger feels like." "Is there a price?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. "There's always a price with men like you. The price is your survival," Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal rasp. "I have put my mark on you. The city knows you belong to the DeLuca name now. If I let you go back to that slum, I look weak. And in my world, weakness is a death sentence for everyone involved. You aren't just a girl who sent a wrong text anymore, Sarah. You are a statement. I can't let you give that back." He pushed the check back toward her with a single finger. Sarah looked at the paper, then at the man who had effectively claimed her life. The golden cage had finally locked, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't just being protected, she was being kept. The transition was total, a quiet revolution that replaced the scent of damp concrete with the fragrance of fresh lilies and expensive leather. Sarah stood on the balcony of the uptown penthouse, watching the city lights flicker like a sea of diamonds below. In the nursery behind her, Leo slept in a silence so profound it was almost unnerving. There were no sirens here, no shouting neighbors, no footsteps of men coming to take what little she had left. She caught her reflection in the glass. The woman staring back wore silk and carried herself with a stillness she hadn't possessed 48 hours ago. The hollows in her cheeks had begun to fill, and the frantic light of survival in her eyes had settled into something deeper, something shadowed. She was no longer just Sarah Bennett, the invisible girl from the slums. She had become a ghost in Dante DeLuca's machine, a secret kept behind biometric locks and armed guards. The heavy glass door slid open, and the temperature seemed to drop. Dante stepped onto the balcony, his tie loosened, the aura of a long day of dark business clinging to him like smoke. He didn't speak at first, he simply stood beside her, his presence a silent, overwhelming weight. He looked out at the empire he ruled with a fist of ice, but his eyes kept drifting back to her profile. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice a low vibration in the cool air. "I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop," Sarah admitted, her voice steady. "I keep expecting to wake up back on that mattress, wondering if I can afford a single can of formula." Dante turned to her, his expression unreadable, yet his hand reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything the world knew about him. "That world is dead, Sarah. I burned it down the moment you messaged me." He leaned in closer, his gaze locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. In that moment, Sarah realized the true nature of her new life. Dante wasn't just her protector, she was his penance. In a life built on collateral damage and calculated cruelty, she and Leo were the only things he possessed that weren't stained by his trade. To the underworld, she was his greatest vulnerability, the only soft spot on a man made of stone. To Dante, she was the only thing he was truly afraid to lose. "You aren't a victim anymore," he whispered against the dark. "And you aren't just a mother. You are mine. And as long as I draw a breath, the world will bow to that." Sarah didn't pull away. She leaned into the cold comfort of his shadow. The hunger was gone, replaced by a different kind of ache, the heavy, golden weight of belonging to a monster. As she looked out over the city, she realized she was no longer afraid of the dark. She was the queen of shadows now, and the king was standing right beside her. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. We wish you and your family strength, a life full of joy and peace every day. See you again in the next video.